Hello, friends. So, a month back, I did a video about the situation of oil and how precarious it was, even with the ceasefire being announced, with there being a memorandum of understanding between the US and Iran. Now, cut to today, and as we all know, the memorandum is scrapped. There's fighting again between the two countries. So, why is this happening? If I said it was precarious, a month back, then surely the actors involved, especially on the US side, know that it is against their interest to restart this war because you could be then staring at Armageddon if you're going to restart the war now. Maybe there still will be Armageddon, but what is the shape of that disaster going to be? Because I think that when you see these kind of apparently irrational decisions being taken again and again, you have to start questioning what is actually going on. Maybe that there are things underneath, there are patterns that actually point to what is really at work here, which may not be what looks obvious on the surface. Or, of course, all of these conspiracy theories, if you want to call them, that could be wrong. Speaking for myself, I used to be skeptical about conspiracy theories until I found out how large the Epstein files blowout actually was, how large the web of people entrapped in it actually was, and how so many people had interacted with someone who was connected to the daughter of Robert Maxwell. I don't need to say anything more. If you know, you know. That's all. So, anyway, let's get into it. So, I want to read out a few headlines and I'm going to put the links in the description. Let me also change the hand with which I'm holding the mic. I should have never held it in the left hand. So, anyway, one news point, rather, one piece of news that you should focus on is that US energy firms added seven new rigs just in the last week. And that takes their total to the highest number since April of last year. Up to that point, they had been drawing down, they had been reducing the number of rigs. Now they have increased it, and it's at the highest level since April last year. Obviously, that means it is going to trend upwards. That is one thing. Another thing, the EU has been importing record quantities of LNG from Russia, which they tell everyone is their biggest existential threat, and which they have been admonishing everyone to go against because they need to punish the regime for its invasion of Ukraine, and they have been buying record quantities of LNG from them. Against that, consider this: the price of sulfur has doubled in the last 6 months. Doubled. And again, I'm going to put out the link for that in the description of the video. This is all publicly available data. It's just not data that perhaps the mainstream media may be willing to highlight. And we're going to get into that in a minute. So, yeah, sulfur is at some kind of record breaking price. And where do you need sulfur? Well, sulfur goes to make matchsticks, it goes into fertilizers. I mean, I could just go on listing the various uses of it. It's one of the most heavily used chemicals in the industry. Let's just put it that way. And it's also a byproduct of petroleum, which is why you're seeing this spike in the price of sulfur, which means that its supply has been affected because of the war. Now, that should immediately lead you to ask a question, but wait a minute, I was told that crude prices have only marginally gone up and they're still well below $100 a barrel. So, what's actually going on here? And this is where I get into the title of the video, that we are being sleepwalked into Armageddon. Why do I say sleepwalked? Because what is the thing that we all do when we hear that there's going to be a crisis? We look at the crude oil prices. That has been the leading indicator of something going wrong. When there is a war, usually the crude oil prices goes up. And when I say goes up, it goes way up. I remember that throughout the years that the US was occupying Iraq, so roughly a period from about 2003 to around 13, 14 or so, the crude oil prices consistently stayed above $100 a barrel, going above 110 frequently as well. And we are now talking about the Hormuz Strait itself being disrupted. 20% of crude oil you consumed in the world flows through the Hormuz Strait, and yet people are completely okay with this. So what is going on? So look, I don't have the wherewithal to come up with a coherent explanation of how the crude oil prices are being manipulated, whether they are being manipulated. I can't really get into that. What I can tell you is something that corroborates what I just told you about sulfur. I work in the beverages industry, so obviously a lot of the raw materials, I should say packaging materials specifically that we use, are also petroleum byproducts. I can tell you that resin prices have gone absolutely through the roof. I've never seen such high prices in the last 3.5 years. And just since about Jan or Feb of this year, that is just before the war began, from then to now, the prices are nearly double. They're probably actually double. I just don't know. Look, we buy in bulk. We are good buyers of of resin and other petroleum-linked byproducts that are used in beverages. So maybe the buyers who can't match our scale might be getting higher prices. So that tells you that things that actually come out of crude oil are in fact costing way more than they used to before the war. And I think you can come to know about that if you see the prices at the petrol pump in any country where the government is not actively trying to manage the petrol price to, what should I say, uh, shield the impact on the end customer. In Zimbabwe, for example, the prices have gone up by 50 cents from from when the war began. So we are seeing that impact in byproducts of crude. It's just not visible in crude, which then leads people to think that, okay, yeah, there is something going on between US and Iran, but it's going to be okay. No. It's actually not going to be okay at all. And this is where the first two factoids that I mentioned come into the picture. One is why are US energy companies adding more and more rigs with every week to increase their stock of crude oil production so that it substitutes for what the US used to import from the Middle East? That's one possibility. And likewise, why is the EU stockpiling on liquefied natural gas from Russia? Because, well, at the same time, and this is again underreported, at the same time as they are doing this stockpiling, Ukraine has been striking energy facilities of Russia. So, one of the largest producers of oil and gas in the world is Russia. The Eastern Hemisphere heavily depends on Russia for its supplies of oil and gas, and their own capacity to serve you is being depleted as we speak. So, what is actually going on here? So again, this is just a theory. Don't let's say don't hold my words to it. Like don't make a bet on it. But it is worthwhile to start exploring what is actually going on. There was a speech given by Marco Rubio last year in the EU at the Munich Security Conference, which was, I think, the significance of that was not fully appreciated. So Marco Rubio goes and praises colonialism and imperialism, and he then says that under Trump, the US is going to offer muscular, powerful leadership so that they can recapture the glory of, whether he used the white race or something, I don't know, but that was basically the implication. And in response to what he said, the European elites who were listening to that speech, they were not horrified. In fact, they gave him a standing ovation. So they know and he know what the game is all about. And what is the game? Again, this is my theory. See, what has happened over the last 100 years is that there was this little thing called the First World War that the European countries fought between themselves. And because the First World War was settled on terms that Germany was greatly aggrieved by, we eventually ended up in a Second World War because you know the story about how Hitler came to power in Germany and he in to put it very crudely, he decided to avenge what had happened at Versailles. So in the middle of all this, they end up depleting their own power heavily. They can't hold on to their colonies. And the US seizes this opportunity to basically goad them, especially the UK, to give up their colonies in exchange for the US supporting them to get through the post war rebuilding phase. Why did they do it? Because at that time they wanted to shift the balance of power so that they become the number one superpower. And that was how it played out. For a while, the US and the Soviet Union basically divided the world between themselves. And then by the end of the 80s, the Soviet Union also collapsed. So now in the Eastern Hemisphere, there is really only one military superpower, and that is Russia. Now think back to 2022 and what happened then. Russia invades Ukraine, and perhaps if it had been only a war between Russia and Ukraine, then by now Russia might have been able to subjugate Ukraine. The war would be over. But as we know that that's not what has happened. There has been enormous funding and support for Ukraine from the US and the EU. Now, why did they do this? Because A, it looks very morally correct. You can say that Russia is the aggressor and we are simply defending a victim here. The real story is probably a little more complicated than that, but that works as a general high level narrative. And B, by dragging out this war, you weaken Russia. So that is the more important goal that they are achieving. And in the middle of this, what does US do under Trump's second term? First, they make Venezuela their colony in more or less. They are also trying to similarly colonize Cuba. That is also going on and getting scant attention because of the third thing, which is the war against Iran. Why is Iran important? I think many people have gone over this, but it's basically the last remaining major source of resistance to Israel in the region. If you weaken Iran, then the US and Israel together control the Middle East like never before. So, and even if they don't manage to weaken them or weaken them as fast as they would like, in the meantime, they are hurting an important ally of Russia and China in the Middle East. That is a goal that they are anyway achieving. And so, as you see that the level of support that Russia and China are able to extend to Iran is much more limited. Why? Because Russia is already stretched, it already has its hands full against Ukraine. Now, what does all this have to do with colonialism, with World War One and Two, and Marco Rubio's speech? Well, that is actually what they essentially want to do. They want to recolonize the Eastern Hemisphere by stealth. And how are they going to do that? Well, why do we now talk about the 21st century belonging to Asia? Because much of the manufacturing capacity has now shifted to Asia, much of it to China specifically, but it's also Japan, South Korea. There are many other Vietnam. There are many other India also to an extent. There are many other industrial powerhouses in the region. And what do none of them really have? Large crude oil reserves. And what does the US have? It has substantial crude oil reserves. It is again one of the largest producers of oil in the world. So, and likewise, what do these industrial powerhouses in Asia don't have? they don't have that much military power. They, maybe you could say China to some extent, but certainly it can't go head to head with the US. And China keeps an eye on Taiwan. It very much would like to make Taiwan a part of China again, which irritates the US extremely because, of course, all the semiconductors that the US needs come from Taiwan. So, this is a way to weaken Asia by stealth, by pretending that you, as in US, had nothing to do with it. You went to war to remove an oppressive regime. I think that we have to acknowledge in all fairness that the Iranian regime is extremely oppressive. It has also been sponsoring acts of terrorism against Israel. Now, we can go on debating about what Israel in turn has been doing to Palestine, what it has been doing in Gaza and the West Bank. That's all a separate debate. Uh, the point is that this is a narrative that US can use to say, hey, we were fighting a good war for all of you, and I'm sorry that there are these costs. What are the costs going to be? Basically, just wait and see, and you're going to see that the supplies of oil and gas to Asia are going to get extremely constrained over the next few months. And why do I say this with so much confidence? So now here I come to another bit of news that I can't give you a link for. And that news, which I know as a professional in logistics, is that it has become rather difficult to get vessels booked to carry material from India to Africa. And the reason we are being given is that there is extreme diversion of vessels to the US and EU. And look, in order to go to the US and the EU, they don't have to now anymore go through the Middle East. I mean, rather, it has become extremely difficult to go through the Middle East. So they can just use other routes and other transshipment points and bypass this entire region entirely. So if there is not enough flow of cargo from this region, Africa and Middle East, into Asia, there are going to be all kinds of shortages, and those shortages are likely to then affect the industrial output of these countries. And now that they are weaker, the US reindustrializes and makes us buy from them again, just as it used to be sort of in the 18th and 19th century when the European powers colonized Asia and made us buy their commodities at a price of their asking. I'm not saying it's going to be exactly like that, and none of this may actually pan out because uh, it all depends on the success of this mission. But is this the idea that is behind all of what is going on? Yes, that is at least my take on it, that why they are prolonging this conflict when they've had many opportunities to bring it to an end, to achieve a compromise on fairly reasonable terms with Iran, perhaps terms that the US may not have liked, but which, if you look at it from the Iran point of view, might have been pretty reasonable. And they have eschewed all these opportunities because it is in their interest to extend this conflict in a way that it ends up hurting Asia. And in the meantime, the US and the EU, perhaps EU to a less extent, because the US is not completely trusting EU yet. There is this whole dynamic of EU trying to, in a way, play both sides. Again, that's a discussion for another video, but certainly the US wants to weaken Asia dramatically, but and because it sees that by doing that, it can reverse the flow, the physical flow of goods eventually in a way that US now again becomes a large exporter. This, at least, is my take on it. If you find this controversial, feel free to disagree and let your voice your disagreement in the comments. And if you have other thoughts building up on what I've said, please do share. I think, look, I'm just a normal dude with access to the internet, so there are very likely things that you know that I don't. So please feel free to share, and let's discuss more about this in the upcoming videos. Thank you.